throughout this presentation MSF. That just stands for Médecins Sans Frontières. That's the French acronym for Doctors Without Borders. So if you hear me say MSF, that's what I'm talking about. So MSF began in 1971. It was a group of French doctors and journalists that joined together that wanted to create kind of a different kind of a medical humanitarian organization. The doctors, they had been working with the Red Cross in Biafra, it's a region of Nigeria, where they were seeing that the government, basically the government was deliberately blocking food from reaching people in the region. And because they were working with the Red Cross, you probably know the Red Cross doesn't often speak out about the atrocities it witnesses because it sees it as crucial to enabling them to get access to certain areas. MSF wanted to be able to do a little bit more of that, so these doctors and journalists broke away and ended up founding MSF. So the basic principles that they go by are, there's three really important principles for MSF, and that is independence, impartiality, and neutrality. So we will, I'll just go over each one of those real quickly and what that means for us as an organization. Neutrality just means that it really quite applies to the Gaza conflict. It means that we don't take sides in armed conflict situations. If there are requests or needs on both sides, we will treat both sides. In the case of Gaza, we were not requested or needed by on the Israeli side. We were not requested by the Israeli authorities, so we did not work on that side. But we have been working in the occupied Palestinian territories since 1989, I believe. So impartiality, that means that we will treat anyone who comes into an MSF clinic or an MSF location that needs medical care. This includes combatants if they leave their guns at the door. That's why we have this sign up here. Independence means that we are free from political, military, economic, religious agendas. So that really kind of, when we look at our funding, that really determines who we take funding from, because we don't want to take funding that would tie us to any of these types of agendas. In both international and U.S. funding, you'll see that the vast majority comes from individuals. International, we get a little more from corporations. The only governments that we take money from internationally are ones that basically have no strings attached with it. In the U.S., we take no government funding. It mostly comes from individuals, and then we get small amounts from foundations and corporations. This is just a little bit on how we spend what we get. Internationally, 76% of our budget goes to program activities. In the USA, the proportion we get is even higher, partially because we have one office in the US, and so our overhead for management is smaller. So MSF works in, these were the countries that we worked in 2013, and it's about 67 countries. The yellow ones, I was looking up to see what that was, actually, because it wasn't sure what the yellow was. I think it's basically countries that we worked in part of the year but do not still have ongoing missions there. But if there's anything in this presentation that you have more of a question about, you can go to doctorswithoutborders.org or msf.org. And they have a current map that's interactive that you can look on and click on the country and see exactly what we're doing and updates on what our work is in that country. So what we do in these countries, most of what we do is respond to armed conflict. And a lot of the times we're already in places where armed conflict erupts, in the case of Gaza. But a lot of times we're going into an area where there's either people fleeing violence or we're treating people after they are victims of violence. We also do a lot with malnutrition. We also, about 40% of our programs are working with epidemics, and you've probably seen a lot in the news lately. We are responding to the Ebola outbreak in West Africa. Then we also work a little bit with natural disasters. It's what gets a lot of news attention, but it's actually only about 5% of our operations. And then we work with populations who are excluded from healthcare for one reason or another: migrant workers, prisoners, street children. And this kind of applies to Gaza because, in a way, because they already have an existing health system, but even before the outbreak of the Operation Protective Edge, the closure and the siege on Gaza had multiple effects on their healthcare system. So some of the things that we do when we're working in those different areas: we do primary healthcare clinics, mobile clinics, hospital support, which is something that I'm going to talk about what we were doing in Gaza. And then MSF puts together a lot of ready-made kits and guidelines so that when these crises hit, when there is a need for something very quickly, we have pre-made kits ready to go. For example, this is a cholera kit that will have anything from tables and chairs, pens and pencils, to all the medications, treatment tablets for water, things like that. We also, one of the other important activities that we do is bearing witness, and we, if it really has to do with if we witness atrocities in the course of our work, we speak to what we see on the ground, and so that is how we speak out. A lot of these positions are actually taken by people in the area. For example, I believe it's on one of the next slides that about 92% of the people that are doing the work on the ground in the field are not international workers. They're usually from the host country where we work. So we were working with a lot of Palestinian employees and national staff where we work. Our first project in the occupied Palestinian territories was in 1989. The current projects that we have projects in the West Bank, in Nablus, Hebron, and in East Jerusalem. So basically what our teams are doing in the West Bank is they are doing mental health response. And that is in relation to violence, violence between settlers and Palestinian populations. Sometimes it's violence in between different Palestinian factions or families, but a lot of it is a result of the occupation. They have a lot of cases of young children that are just very terrorized by a lot of this, and so a lot of the mental health work is with young children. In Gaza, I'll talk a little bit about what our operations were there, but first of all, I'm sure you guys are probably all quite familiar with this area of the world. Before I went there, I really wasn't, so I'm just going to do a quick overview. It's only actually in land area about 25 miles long and anywhere from 3.5 to 6.5 miles wide. So it's a tiny space of land, and the population's about 1.8 million people. Now, in the north and in the east, that is the border with Israel, and then in the south, that's the border with Egypt. So since 2007, there have been land, air, and sea blockades imposed around the Gaza Strip by Israel. There used to be more freedom of movement between Gaza and Egypt, but with the change in power in 2012, a lot of that got shut down because their relationships with Hamas, with the change in power in Egypt, were not, all of that kind of broke down. So they've kind of been trapped on all sides in a lot of ways. That, coupled with the fact that for a long time the ruling power in Gaza was Hamas, and then the power that controls the West Bank is the Palestinian National Authority. They were, of course, not always in agreement, and so they recently came together to form a unity government this June. But before that time, the fact that there was kind of infighting between those two groups within their own government basically just brought yet another hardship on the people of Gaza. It basically kind of ended up blocking them on all sides from kind of the support that they could get. So this is the Erez crossing, and this is how we would get in and out of Gaza. There's several different checkpoints that you have to go through. You have to coordinate coordination from Israeli authorities, the West Bank authorities, and the Hamas authorities. So you go through 3 different checkpoints when you go into the Gaza Strip. Kerem Shalom is the place where they would let goods in and out of Gaza. That a lot of the goods coming in and out of Gaza have been very limited in the past several years. The rationale given by the Israeli government has been that they are concerned that they would be dual-use things like cement and cables. They cite concerns that those could be used to make weapons. But what it ends up doing is really blocking a lot of new construction. There was a hospital that, the hospital I was working in was trying to have new construction, trying to build a new hospital, and it had been under construction for years. And every time I would ask somebody about it, they were like, oh yeah, that's probably going to be another 3 to 4 years. They had kind of just become used to this very, very slow ongoing construction because they couldn't get any cement. This is the Rafah terminal, and this is in the south with the border with Egypt. But again, this has been also very limited for crossings for people in and out since 2012. So these, basically, this is at the Erez crossing, and the reason I put this in here is because actually in the background, it just kind of shows an interesting little background with the power supply and there's a little area I'll go back to the map a little bit here. The area that is close to the border is also kind of a no man's land. Anywhere from 300 to 600 meters, farmers are either not allowed to go or are very afraid to go because the Israeli military has basically said this is an area where we don't allow you to farm. Also, there is restrictions on fishing. Their fishing boats cannot go any farther than 6 nautical miles out. So these are other things that really limit their economy when you look at their ability to farm and to fish, to build new infrastructure, all things that are really, really dampening their economy. So this is just a picture of one of their fishing boats. This is our MSF office here. So our office was on the ground floor, and then our living quarters were in the second floor. The time I was there, we had about 35 national staff, Palestinians, and anywhere from 3 to 5 international people. So a very small group of expats. It was mostly Palestinians. So basically, just again to kind of show, we would, at the time when I came in, I was pretty much every day taking a car, MSF cars, from Gaza down to Khan Yunis in the south. And this is also interesting to see. Basically what we would do is for our clinic operations, we would pick up patients to come to the clinic all throughout the Gaza Strip and bring them into our clinic in Gaza to get dressings, burn care, because transportation was often very difficult for a lot of people. You'd have to take sometimes 3 or 4 different taxis to get from one place to another in Gaza, and the road conditions were not all that great. This is Nasser Hospital, where I was working in the south in Khan Yunis. It was a 6-bed ICU. I was brought in because I had experience working in an ICU and training ICU nurses, and basically the idea was that there is a university that trains medical, that educates medical professionals, doctors, nurses in Gaza. But as far as people going out to get continuing education, to get updates on evidence, that is very, very limited. There was one time during my time in Gaza where we were able to get some of our staff out just for a 2-day conference. We had to fight and beg and plead with authorities to get them out, and just for 2 days. And some of them were telling me they hadn't left the Gaza Strip in 5 to 12 years. Some of them hadn't been out in that long. So basically, I was brought in to just start to try and build. MSF wanted to build a relationship with this hospital in the south for a couple of different reasons. One, it was just that the quality of care they had seen was for that area in the South. That was one of the hospitals that, through working in that hospital in the past, MSF had seen that it was in need of just some extra help. There is another hospital in the North that would usually get a lot more of the attention from the central drug supply, from different actors and trainers coming in. And a lot of the other hospitals kind of got forgotten, and this was one of them. And so they really wanted to bring a couple of us in to be able to start building relationships with people and working alongside them to improve the quality of care. That had a lot of challenges in it, because I don't know about you guys, but I just thought about it when I came in here, and I thought, if somebody came into my hospital unit and said, "Hi, I'm going to help you improve your quality of care. Isn't that great?" Like, I would not, I'd kind of look at them and say, "Well, who do you think you are?" It's just, there's a lot of trust building that has to go on with that, and really a lot of relationship building with mutual understanding, saying, okay, we're here just as much to learn from you as you are to learn from us. This is not a hierarchical or condescending relationship in any respect. And so there was a lot of just diplomacy at the beginning that really had to go on to kind of build relationships with people there. But it ended up being, it was challenging at the beginning, but it ended up being one of the most rewarding parts of our mission at the end. We really built some great working relationships with these nurses and doctors, and I was really impressed with their ability to work under conditions that a lot of them haven't been paid in months, because they're employed by the Hamas government, and so for a long time, basically Hamas was running out of money, and everybody had this hope that when the unity government came along, that would mean that people would finally get paid their salaries. But what happened was that because the other faction of the Palestinian leadership, the West Bank authorities, it's called Fatah, they basically, when they came in and formed the unity government with Hamas, they said, well, we want to make sure that all of these positions that people have within our ministries of health, that now that we have this unity government, we want to make sure that everybody has gotten these positions by fairly. We want to see, were people put in here for political reasons, and so that got tied up in a lot more red tape. So they were just, from all sides, under just tremendous stress. And so a lot of these nurses that I worked with were coming even though they weren't getting paid. But they also knew that if they did not come to work, then they could get very easily replaced. And the unemployment rate in the Gaza Strip, I've seen numbers in the last couple of days anywhere from the UN, anywhere from 35 to 40%. So they were kind of trapped in that situation in a lot of ways. So I think a lot of them, some of them really did have a very good, big sense of commitment to caring for their patients, and I really saw that in some of them. And then other than that, it was mostly like, I even if this is a job that I don't know when I'm going to get paid next, I'd rather have this than no job, because then that's an even more uncertain future. So it was very challenging for them. So it was 6 beds, and all very close together. And a lot of the things that we were working on were things like infection control, patient safety, and then respiratory care was another area that we worked on. So we worked on this in the background there, on the left in the back, is Dr. Louis Niquet. He was the ICU physician that I worked with while I was there. And then the woman standing beside him is his facilitator. Both he and I had ICU facilitators. They were our translators and our right hand. I mean, I feel like most of that program, the only reason it worked was because of them, because they knew they were our cultural liaisons, our translators, everything. This is just showing some of the, the work with the ventilators. Their equipment would often malfunction. Sometimes we had and it wasn't just an issue of getting people in to fix it. Sometimes they wouldn't have the parts and they're not available in the Gaza Strip. There were some actors in the I believe it was the Red Cross that was working with trying to get some of the equipment to fix these, the parts to fix the ventilators. But also the oxygen supply wasn't that steady. So we'd have things alarming all the time, and most of the time that's supposed to tell you when something's wrong with your patient. But you kind of get desensitized to them because these alarms, you can't shut them off, and they're alarming all the time because the equipment isn't actually functioning the way it's supposed to. So one of the things that we were working on was just, this was just an example of one of our infection control practices that we were just trying to get people to, we worked together and they actually came up with some of the ideas for this themselves, but getting people to adhere to more rigorous infection control standards and use antibiotic therapy more judiciously instead of there's a kind of widespread practice in the Middle East and not just in Palestine of giving people antibiotics no matter what they come in for. Just while you're in the ICU, you need antibiotics. Well, that contributes to a lot of antibiotic resistance. And so we were trying to work with that, but then also trying to help prevent infections so that once they were kind of peeling back the antibiotics, they would actually still be preventing infections from the lines that they were putting in, and not starting to see all of these infections from peeling back the antibiotics. So basically, it was so this was a 6-month program. There had been one nurse that had done this before me, and then there is another nurse that came and took over after I did. So that's what I was doing for the first 6 months of my mission. One of the things that just to mention here, just to get an idea of the background of what they were dealing with, not only just inconsistent salaries, but supplies. This 6-bed ICU would have 1 box of gloves to use for the day for all their nurses. That was usually their allotment. And any of you who've worked in healthcare before can probably know that that's, I came in and I was like, what, you have one, wow, okay. So it's, they get creative, they come up with judicious use of things. Sometimes some of it was, they didn't end up reusing them, but there were certain areas where we were trying to kind of brainstorm some creative solutions to that, but that's just one of the examples. Sometimes they said that one time they went for a month it was 2 weeks without having alcohol to rubbing alcohol to disinfect things. So just because basically everything that would come into the Gaza Strip came through Ramallah in the north, in the West Bank, and it would either be through international donations or it would be coming from the Fatah government. So it wasn't always very consistent, and they really had no control over, they could request things, but especially also because of their economic situation, their Ministry of Health was really strapped, they were suffering shortages all the time. So once Protective Edge hit, this, of course, really changed the game for everything in our operations. So it was July 8th. Actually, my first project ended, my last day was July 7th. I was supposed to leave Gaza Strip on July 9th, and Protective Edge happened on July 8th, basically kind of broke out on July 8th. So that night we all kind of were sitting there and had a discussion, and my medical supervisor had just come into Gaza, and it was a good thing because normally she worked out of Jerusalem, and had she not come into Gaza, usually the problem was that once a crisis hit, it's much more difficult to get people in than to get people out. Once they're in, you can usually work within the Gaza Strip, but trying to get them in, trying to get coordination to get people into Gaza became much more difficult. So it was a really good thing that she was there. And also they said, well, we don't have, we have really, you're the only other international medical staff right now. Can you stay until we can get more people in? So that was what I ended up doing. So just kind of going to use this timeline to talk about what was going on in the crisis. Now, so you'll see some of these figures and graphics that I'll use here. A lot of them are coming from the UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, their Occupied Palestinian Territories website. It's a really great website if you want any other just facts and information about what different humanitarian organizations are doing there, because they just basically are gathering all the information to kind of give to different organizations. So that's where we were getting a lot of our, when we were communicating with journalists, we were getting a lot of our numbers from them and from the Ministry of Health the Palestinian Ministry of Health in Gaza. So if you look at the first few days of the crisis, this was when it was just basically airstrikes. So when Protective Edge started, their first the first level of combat was missiles being launched from the Gaza Strip and airstrikes and Navy shellings from Israeli forces. This, and then if you look on there, I believe it was the night of the 18th. And I don't have a way to point that out, but if you see here, the first 2 days when those numbers really fatalities really start to jump, that's the 20th, and so that's about a day and a half after the ground invasion started. So that was when the fatalities and injuries really started to shoot up. So in the beginning, what we were doing, I think it's easy to kind of say to kind of have this vision of we're MSF, we're like running in on the front lines, like always like doing the most urgent emergency care, and sometimes that's the case. But in Gaza, it's already a functioning health system. So what we were there to do, what our response was to say, okay, where does this current health system have gaps? Where do we, how can we communicate with them and see where their needs are, ask them what their needs are, where are the gaps, where can we fill these gaps? And then also that we still had our own patient population to kind of look after. And so in the beginning, a lot of it was just coordinating with the Ministry of Health. We were donating our emergency stocks. Usually MSF keeps emergency stocks of things like IV solutions, gloves, gauze, basics, and that was really what hospitals were requesting in the beginning. Sometimes you got kind of wish lists of like these random drugs that people were asking for, but for the most part, it was just very, very basic things that they didn't have enough of. It was gloves, it was gauze, it was IV fluids, and basic medications. So so that was part of that. So that was one of the things that I was doing in the beginning, was just helping to organize what we were getting our supplies together and saying, okay, like where are these supplies needed? Do we need to get them to the south? Do we need to get them to the hospital that's right next to us? The problem was actually getting this stuff there, because if you guys can imagine, so the airstrikes, what would happen is that if an airstrike was hitting a house, a lot of times there would be some sort of, usually but not always, there would be some sort of warning beforehand. Either people would get a call, a text message. Sometimes there would be a little warning bomb on the roof, like a very small warning, like knocking on the roof. And then several minutes later, that house would be bombed. But there would also be indiscriminate bombings of people in the streets. There would be people targeted on their motorcycle as they're driving along. So there was no way for us to be able to predict where these strikes were going to occur. We knew that in the MSF office, it's a humanitarian space. Because we're a humanitarian organization, because we're a medical organization, we're identified from the air. We are, and Israeli Defense Forces have our coordinates, so we are protected in that sense. But trying to move throughout the Gaza Strip became very, very difficult for us the way that we would normally do it. So trying to get these kits to the hospital in the south, for example, was especially difficult. What we had to do in the beginning was to basically we would call Israel and say, okay, as a humanitarian organization, we want to make this movement to the south. Can you guarantee us safe passage? And we would tell them exactly what time we wanted to leave, what roads that we wanted to take, and what time we wanted to be back. And so we would try and do a lot of things at once in the south. The first movement we made there was maybe about 5 days after the operation started. There were only 2 staff members that went on that operation, and they took supplies. They coordinated with the Ministry of Health. They talked with the ICU. They scouted for future areas for us. They were doing lots of different things at once to take advantage of that. So the other thing that this really affected was our clinic. So our clinic that we were operating in Gaza was there to, basically we were operating a clinic for post-operative care for people. About 80% of our patients were burn patients. And this is actually an indirect result of the siege. There was a real crisis of electricity because there was not enough fuel get allowed into the Gaza Strip to run the power plant. So there were rolling blackouts of electricity. So people would use alternative types of heating, lighting, cooking sources, different alternative types of fuel, and these were all unstable or sometimes people would be leaving candles burning at night. All of these led to a lot more domestic accidents, especially with young kids. So we treated a lot of burn patients. It was specialized dressing care and physiotherapy to really try and get people back to functional status. But as you saw with just people have been kind of spread out throughout the Gaza Strip, and we were normally bringing people in with our cars, but once the airstrikes hit, we weren't able to do that anymore. Normally, on a normal day, we would see about 90 patients, and I kind of started managing the clinic when the crisis hit, and we would during those days, we would see maybe 12, because we were limited to the amount of people who were able to come in on their own, basically. Sometimes we would get people in our office. This is actually our MSF office, and this is a little girl who had a domestic accident, and it just, for her, it wasn't actually related to the crisis. She had spilled some hot tea, but she was coming alone in the streets, and just walking in these streets where, she doesn't know if an airstrike is going to be happening. And I remember this little girl, she was about 10 years old, and our project coordinator looked her in the eye and he said, you're very brave. You're coming by yourself. Your parents aren't coming with you. Why? And she looked right at him and she said, well, we're all going to die one day. And I just thought, this girl has had to grow up a lot faster than she should have right now. It's very brave of her, but I would never wish that on anybody. So that was what we were doing in the clinic. Just actually to go back to that before I start talking about the hospital. Because we weren't able to reach the vast majority of our patients, what we were doing is doing things like preparing dressing kits, because a lot of these people needed daily dressings of their burns to be able to have good recovery and to avoid getting infections. Well, so what we would try to do is put together these dressing kits with gauze, salve, different specialized creams that they would need. And then if we knew that there was a movement that we had already coordinated to one area of Gaza, or if there was a humanitarian corridor where we knew there was going to be a ceasefire for a few hours, that we would try to drop these dressing kits in centralized locations and then call our patients and say, okay, we have these kits. You can come and try and pick these up in these different locations, and they already kind of knew how to take care of the wounds and how to change the dressings. So it was just a lot of planning and logistical coordination that we were doing in the beginning. And then right about the 18th, it was actually just a couple days before I ended up leaving because we got more staff in. We were able to get surgeons, anesthesiologists, other OR and ICU nurses in kind of in shifts into the Gaza Strip. And we started working in the hospitals. But it took several days for us to actually get that coordinated with the Ministry of Health and for them to say, okay, yes, we do need that. The cases of the injuries that we're seeing are rising. We need you to come in and help with us. So this is Kelly, one of our anesthesiologists, and she's just amazing. It's a little child. A lot of the cases that they were seeing were women and children. I remember a story from one of our other anesthetists, and she said that it was a case of I think it was a 10-year-old boy who came in with about 100 pieces of shrapnel all over his body. And they ended up finding out not too far into caring for him that he was very unstable, and they were able to catch that he was bleeding internally from one of the pieces of shrapnel and were able to do an emergency surgery to stabilize him. But Kelly had been telling us stories of the fact that if people are standing when a blast hits, there can be amputation of limbs just from or just shattering of the leg bones, so that later it necessitates having to amputate because of just the sheer amount of damage to the limbs. If a blast hits, there's crush injuries to the lungs, burns, and then even if you're farther away, it's just flying shrapnel everywhere. And even a small piece of shrapnel, if it hits a vital organ, if it hits a major artery, it's very dangerous. So those were some of the types of cases that they were seeing. Kind of back to the timeline, right when we were getting people into the hospital and when the ground invasion was starting was when they said, okay, we have people here. We're going to try and get you out and get these other people in. But I was still in Jerusalem communicating with a lot of them and doing interviews and communicating with journalists. But there's something that happened on the 20th when I left that kind of changed, and kind of some of the events that were happening leading up to that kind of changed how we acted there. And it was that up until then, we had been doing these coordination of movements with people throughout the Gaza Strip, with coordinating with the Israeli authorities. And normally we'd been guaranteed safe passage. The day that I left, they coordinated and said, okay, we want to move people out and move some other people in. Can you guarantee us safe passage? And they said yes, but then when they were bringing people back into Gaza City from Erez, an airstrike hit not 300 meters from the car. Also that day, they saw in the hospital, they saw two ambulance drivers that had been hit by shelling from the ground invasion clashes, and also 2 ambulance drivers that were killed. And this coupled with the amount, just the really big amounts of civilian casualties and injuries that we were seeing, prompted MSF to speak out and say, there are humanitarian law principles that are not being respected here. So MSF issued a press release on July 20th saying, we are calling on Israel to respect humanitarian space of and kind of citing that there were strikes that happened close to our car, and then the ambulance drivers that were killed and those that were injured, and then the civilian casualties. And as you probably all know from the news, this kept happening. So there were other hospitals that were hit, UN schools, lots of medical facilities were damaged in this. So that was that point when MSF said, okay, we want to speak out in this way. So this is just just more of the pictures of what they were seeing in the hospital. They had several surgical teams. About a total of 3 different surgical teams that have come in and out since the start of the ground invasion up until now. This was at the El Shifa hospital, turned into a place where people were just staying on the hospital grounds because they thought that might be a safer place for them to go. It's such a small area that they really run out of places to go where you hear that your area is being targeted, and maybe you did get a warning that says, okay, you need to evacuate, your area is going to be bombed. But a space that small with that's that heavily populated, people run out of places to go pretty quickly. So eventually, some of the other things that the UN schools were completely overwhelmed. The hygiene standards were just incredibly, everything was overwhelmed. Food, hygiene, water. They had been prepared for an emergency, but nothing on this scale. So this was just some of our response afterwards to just help out in some of the UN schools. These are some of our our staff. This was my facilitator on the right, and this was my supervisor Abu Abed in the middle there. And he's an amazing guy. Some of his you can see some of his blogs on our MSF website. And this is Amani is the name of my facilitator. This is her, and I contacted her and said, "Can I share this?" Because this is her. After I left Gaza, I saw a post from her a few days after saying, "Well, we've received warning that our area is going to be hit. We tried to evacuate. The schools are full. We tried to go to a beach camp. There were shellings happening everywhere. We went back to our house because at least if we die, we die in our house with dignity." And that was incredibly. She's okay. I've received word that she's okay. Her family's okay. But I just couldn't imagine how frightening. This is her young daughter, Malak. Malak means angel. She's 5 years old. This is their area in Rafah. This is some of the just pictures of the destruction, just whole areas leveled by this. Some of the little kids, this was before, just playing on the beach, and I put this in because probably some of the biggest effects were on kids. When strikes would hit, you would hear stories of kids hiding under tables, grabbing onto their parents. Some of our staff members said their kids would vomit when the airstrikes hit. They're incredibly traumatized by this. This was one of the little sons of one of our staff members. And this is a post from Abu Abed. The photo's mine, but the blogger that I told you about, he just said that this was what he said when he heard of the ceasefire. And he said, I cried and my wife cried too. My 5-year-old daughter was leaping around like a lunatic, yelling, "The war is over, let's celebrate the end of the war." But my sons didn't react at all at first. They couldn't believe it had really happened until they were able to sleep again in their own beds. Today, children can play in the garden again. They can go out and see other people again. They'll be happy for 3 or 4 days, perhaps, and after that, they'll start looking at the houses that have been demolished, everything that has been destroyed. There's no electricity most of the time. Water is a problem. Then they will see that there's lots to be done, and they may become depressed again. Normally, the school year would have begun this week. No one knows when schools will be able to reopen, as lots of people who have lost their homes have taken refuge in schools. Some schools were also bombed. The other thing is that, in my opinion, children need to be given a break. For 7 weeks, there has been shelling, bombs, deaths, and injuries. It's been hell. It will take time to forget, for our children to readapt themselves. I just hope that it won't all start up again. So that's... And this is one of our staff members and his kids at the beach. So, and that's it. I've got a few just sources here if you're interested in finding out more. There's some of MSF's websites here. Sorry, I don't know how much time you allotted for this. I don't know if I left a lot of time for questions, but.
And I may request that you leave it on the what you can do slide.
Yeah.
Because that might be even more important. But why don't we go ahead and open it up for questions?
Why'd they pick me?
Yeah.
Good question. I have no idea. I went through the process of applying for MSF, and you get put into a pool of field volunteers once you apply and you're selected. And then once you're in that pool, then they have people who are placing volunteers in different areas of the world, and they look at your qualifications and your experience and how your experience fits in the area where they want to send a volunteer.
Since impartiality is a guiding principle of MSF, can you kind of speak to how difficult it may be to remain impartial, especially in a conflict such as this, where you are almost universally placed in just one side of the conflict? How difficult is it to keep that mindset?
It is very difficult to keep that mindset, and it's interesting because before the crisis hit, we actually had a discussion with our Palestinian colleagues, and kind of a debate within MSF of should we speak out in Palestine? Is this something that we should be? Is this a case when we should start, looking at our actions and seeing if we should speak out instead of, and if that would compromise our ability to provide medical care. One of the things that is interesting to remember in those situations, though, is that, and something that I saw in kind of passionate debates between our Palestinian colleagues, was that speaking out, we have to kind of consider not only the consequences for us, but for any of especially for the national staff that we work with. So that's always a decision that MSF has to weigh very, very carefully, because even if we are there have been cases where we have spoken out in a crisis or in a conflict, and because we have said, okay, this is too much, we see on this side that we need to speak out against this particular organization or this government or this party. But we have to very, very carefully weigh that, because if our international staff gets kicked out of the country, yes, it's very hard to not be able to provide the care that we were providing, but it also can very much endanger the lives of the people that we were working with in the area. So. Personally, yes, it can be very difficult to maintain, impartiality, neutrality. But we basically, anytime we would kind of be speaking to the media or internationally about this, we would kind of try to remind ourselves these are the principles that allow us to be here in the first place. And so to try and bring it back to saying this is what we see on the ground, and and you can't really argue with if you stick to this is what we see, this is what we're eyewitnessing. That's kind of the way we would handle it.
Yeah. So kind of off of that, you talked a little bit about the logistical challenges of traveling in and out of Gaza. Did you find that the airstrike that happened 300 feet from the vehicle to be more of a commonality than a safe travel would be?
You mean, was it more of a coincidence?
Yeah, did you often face impediments when you were trying to travel on Gaza?
Well, the thing is that basically when we would call and be asked to be guaranteed safe passage, because the airstrikes were very it's a very advanced system, actually, and so at the beginning, they were actually able to guarantee us safe passage, and we were able to carry out our operations without incident. And so, knowing that these airstrikes happen with planning, with very calculated coordinates, and knowing that also we had given our coordinates and our plans to Israeli forces, that made us feel confident in being able to speak out and say, this humanitarian space needs to be respected. Even if it is, we were not saying that we were being targeted, but that our space as a humanitarian organization was not being respected because of this advanced planning that we had tried to coordinate was not respected.
In your time here, did your opinions about the U.S. healthcare system change? Obviously, we have fortunate to have so many more resources, but is there anything less obvious that you really felt and realized from being there?
About the U.S. healthcare system?
Or how doctors work or operate?
Oh, how doctors work and operate? Well, I mean, I think the biggest differences that I was seeing was that some of the things that I actually got frustrated with sometimes here are things that are definitely there for a reason. For example, sometimes working in a U.S. healthcare system, I remember getting frustrated before with things like, just all of the documentation and everything we have to do to avoid being sued, basically, and everything that we that is just done with policy and procedure down to a T. But then when you kind of go and see the lack of that, you kind of realize why those are in place. But so I was actually kind of missing some of those things, surprisingly, when I was over there, just realizing, okay, actually I am a little bit, even though I get frustrated with a lot of things about our U.S. healthcare system working as a nurse, there are some things that are actually, there's always a balance to be had, but there are some things that are there for quite good reason. And that's probably maybe not what you were asking, but that's really the biggest thought that I had while I was over there. Oh, okay.
So, as a Palestinian American, I've been on the receiving end of some of the most horrendous of Israeli attacks, and it's created PTSD for myself. As a healthcare professional, I know you've been trained to do a lot and maybe combat PTSD, but I'm sure when you were there, a lot of the things you saw took it to a whole new level. On the frontier, babies' heads blown off, and children. Could you talk a little bit about your emotional and psychological process or the impact it's had for you personally?
Sure, thank you. And thank you for coming and for sharing that. To be honest, a lot of the emotional impact that I felt from it was coming from things that I would witness in our staff, because at the time that I was there, I was actually not allowed to go to the hospital. We were minimizing our movements until our new team could come in. So it's actually ironic that I was an ICU nurse, and yet I was in our clinic, which was a block away, but it was just what was needed at the time. So I was managing that. But we would get people with blast injuries, burns, and a little girl, 5 years old, that was running away from shelling and ended up colliding with hot water, had burns all down her back. I think that so it's not, I'm sure, as nearly as severe as some of the, as a lot of what my Palestinian colleagues were affected by, and that was what most of my thoughts were while I was there and after I left. I'm very fortunate that I think there were a lot of emotional effects of it for me, of course, but I did not see as much of the frontline violence, and what I saw and heard and experienced from all of the people that I had grown to know and love there, that just the fear that their families were living in on a daily basis. And one of our staff called me the day I was leaving. I was still managing the clinic. He called me and said, "I can't come to work today. My house has just been hit by a rocket. I don't know if my dad is still inside." And he was okay, and his father was okay, but that for me, I think, has been the biggest effect. I still read some of these reports from my friends, the people that I've really grown to care very deeply about, it's there are days when it's a lot more emotional for me than others. It took a while I took a few weeks in France to travel and be away from things for a little bit, but I think the PTSD, the trauma for a lot of the people that I have that are still there and that have witnessed a lot of this has been severe, and MSF is actually responding to that now. Has brought in actually Abu Abed, the blogger that I talked to you guys about, has said that there are mental health professionals that have come in to work with, and we try to advocate to them, please especially include the kids, because this was something that people don't always sometimes forget about, but it's a huge need. Yeah, it's definitely been difficult, but I think so much even more so for the people who are still there. I think about them a lot.
Thank you very much for being here and for your heroism. And I think this is obviously a group which does heroic and humanitarian things, and that anybody should be proud to join with it in healing people, and that the impartiality which you mentioned, is an important thing there. I just want to make a comment on the point about America. This could not have happened without American army. The American Congress, the Senate voted 100-0, including Bernie Sanders in my life. 100-0 to send arms to Israel. There were 3 civilians criminally killed by Hamas rockets. There were 526 children. There are no medicines in this hospital. You think there's an Israeli hospital without medicines? Or you think the United States would not see to it that they had medicine? So one thing for all of us, because this is a point about moral objectivity, this is an occupation. It's a horror. It needs to be stopped. It comes from here down to this school, where there's a lot of praise for the Israeli government, and every person here can make whatever kind of effort we can, from talking to people, from hearing these stories, from doing something to make America different, because we know we're going to blow up the world over the Middle East. So thank you very much for all you've done. But I just wanted to say, I don't think any American who's not in the scene in this way ought to speak to it as, well, we have to be impartial. I'm a Jew, and I'll just say I identify completely with Palestinians who are the Jews of the occupied territories and not their European oppressors.
Thank you.
Yeah, so now that there is a ceasefire, it seems like this story is kind of out of the headlines, but of course the health crisis remains, so maybe you can talk to us a little bit about going forward, especially, the statistic you listed said 11,000 injured that probably still need care, and when we actually look at the fine details of the ceasefire agreement, there's nothing in there about actually lifting the blockade, what the actual mechanisms are, and so it seems like it's still going to be a very major challenge to actually get in the kinds of things that need to be there to actually help with this health crisis. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about the challenges going forward from here.
So right
No idea.
Okay, sorry. So he was just basically asking about so now that there's a ceasefire, that this story is kind of out of the headlines, but there are still major challenges ahead, and that in the ceasefire agreement there was talk of lifting some lifting of the blockade, but so far that has not, there's no real significant lifting that has happened, and so he just asked to talk about the challenges going forward. So, and I mean, it's a very good question. Basically, so there are a few things that I can basically talk to what MSF is doing right now, and they are, we're continuing to receive people in our clinic, and we're receiving a whole lot of new cases since the start of the war. It was basically, I think it was over 100 new burn cases since the start of Operation Protective Edge. But there's just a little bit that basically, there's 32 hospitals existing in Gaza. Now some of them are just very small structures that are technically designated as a hospital, but they're not very well equipped. But of those 32, 15 have been damaged, 14 clinics, 29 ambulances, and 50% of the facilities are closed. 40% of the staff are unable to work. These are all numbers from the UN. So and just the amount of absolute destruction and devastation of homes, structures, schools. Now the power has been affected. Because there is not basically the lack of electricity has other effects that we don't always think about on health. For example, the ability to treat water. Their water treatment plant has been affected because they don't have enough electricity anymore because of damage to infrastructure to run it effectively. So a lot of sewage is just openly being dumped into the sea, and it causes a lot of public health problems. A lot of the UN schools have not only been damaged, but a lot of them are still being used as refuge for people that have no homes. So one of the things, maybe to answer your question, that I'll try and pull up here, and it really shows this pretty well, is a good snapshot from the Office of Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Let's see if I can find that. But basically, they have been speaking out about the fact that the amount of funding that they've been getting is just nowhere near the amount of what is needed for food, for just sanitation projects, water treatment, electricity, and just other basic needs, and then the ability to rebuild, and to be able to get in things like cement, to be able to rebuild these structures and all of these homes and facilities that have been damaged. So those are just a few of the challenges that Gaza is facing right now, and it's enormous, and it's going to take years and years to be able to rebuild the infrastructure and rehabilitate people physically from families that have been broken apart, injuries, amputations, and mental health effects. They're huge.
I think this might actually be a good time to, everyone can hang out and continue. I know, and actually my own question, I was going to have a follow-up, but in the interest of impartiality and neutrality, I will, why don't we close it here, and everyone's welcome to hang around, and hopefully Sarah can stay on a little bit and talk, and we can all talk, and let's give another big round of applause.